Robert Robinson had been saved out of a life of sin through George Whitfield's ministry in England. Shortly after being saved at the age of 23, Robinson wrote the hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, Streams of Mercy Never Ceasing." Well, sadly, Robinson wandered far from those streams of mercy, and like the prodigal son, journeying into a life of worldly living. One day he was traveling by stagecoach and sitting beside a young woman who was engrossed in her book. She ran across a verse that she thought was especially beautiful and asked him what he thought of it. She said, "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love." Bursting into tears, Robinson said, "Madam, I am the poor, unhappy man who wrote that hymn many years ago, and I would give 1,000 worlds if I could enjoy the feelings I had then." Although greatly surprised, the woman reassured him that the streams of mercy mentioned in his hymn still flowed. Mr. Robinson was deeply touched. Turning his wandering heart back to the Lord, he was restored to full fellowship. Mercy, mercy, mercy may be the most undeserved of the gifts that God graciously grants. Let's talk about it. Welcome back to 167, our weekly look into how the theology and doctrine we hear about on Sunday mornings applies to the other hours of our life during the week. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that your pastor doesn't give you some context and an application for the Bible verses that make up his sermon every week. I'm sure all of these servants have the best intention to provide what their flock needs, to know, to live in the presence of God. We're not trying to replace that message. What we're seeking to do is build some depth. When we explore the various topics that we do, it's always with an eye towards the practical meaning and the practical application of that theological idea. We're going to put the idea of God's mercy in that context today because, listen, without it, we are all in deep, deep trouble. You see, unlike love, where something of a definitive verse exists, the divine attribute of mercy requires a little more effort to suss out on our own. When we see the psalmist cry out, "Have mercy on me, O God," you and I are tempted to see that as grace because that's the lens that most Christians interpret the Bible through. We explored grace in an earlier episode, and we defined it as the unmerited goodwill that God shows towards human beings. In a sense, grace is extended not just to a select few, but to all humanity. And that's evidenced by the fact that sinners have not seen mass destruction. Grace has a more specific definition as well that most Christians use, having to do with salvation, echoing Ephesians 2:8. To set it apart, mercy has its center in compassion and love, particularly compassion and love exercised towards those who are suffering or miserable. To take it a step further, we also need to note that mercy also has a common understanding like grace does, and it also has a specific application. We'll look into both of those. By waking up in the morning, we have already experienced the general mercy of God extended to all people, both the redeemed and the unrepentant. When God looks down on his creation and causes the sun to rise and fall over all people, regardless of their salvation standing, he's demonstrating his mercy. Without this regulation, the sun, the moon, and the stars, humankind wouldn't know anything but misery. But as the psalmist says, the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. Few of us will stop to ponder this truth given the influence of naturalism and modernity, but the Christian should not allow ourselves to be drawn into that kind of apathy. Like grace, the sovereign exercise of mercy should be an invitation for thanksgiving and, of course, deeper discipleship. A good meditation for you to consider is the regular thought of just what your life might be like, what it would look like without the 1,001 mercies that God grants you without you even being aware. Perhaps we should strive to become more aware. In her covenant relationship with Yahweh, Israel paints this grand montage of a practical understanding of mercy. Their relationship draws out an important aspect of how we understand mercy as far as the Bible explains it. The first thing we need to note, and this applies to every theological issue, is that God in his sovereignty is under no obligation to extend mercy to anyone or anything. He is in a position of power where all creation, including his favorite creatures, which is us, is subordinate to that power. What that means is that we, his favorite creations, are in no position to demand or even expect mercy. This same power balance that is God in sovereign, complete power, and us subordinate to that. That same power, let me say it a different way. That same power imbalance has to be kept in mind when we study the covenants that God makes. Listen, once again, God is under no obligation to enter into covenant arrangements with his creation that he rules over, that he created. The fact that he does is a condescension to our needs and our inability to meet his rigorous holiness demands. We can ask and beg and even cajole, but because we will always be subordinate in any covenant arrangement, we cannot demand that God be merciful. Therefore, now, don't miss this, watch this. The fact that God is merciful is both an object of worship and a telling look into his very nature. God's devotion to these covenant agreements is an illustration of his faithfulness and his patience. This faithfulness is repeatedly tested by the human parties to all of the covenants. Go and look them up. Both the human parties always fail to uphold their side of the agreement. Their behavior displays their unworthiness to really even be a party to the covenant. And I got to say, more often than we would like to admit, humans break the covenant agreement, almost as if we never made it in the first place. Each step in the lack of human faithfulness is worthy of penalty. It's worthy of destruction, but we'll go with condemnation. And yet, don't miss this. We're worthy of destruction, condemnation, damnation. Yet God, in compassion, views us differently. In his mercy, he recognizes the dark effects of sin. He is always aware of the capriciousness of our commitment to the covenant. And God is also ever aware of his love for his creatures. The result is mercy and merciful actions from the powerful God to the powerless humanity. In fact, as God reflects on his history of compassion to people that don't seem to appreciate it, I always find this funny. He almost appears to wonder about his continued patience. And he asks this, how can I give up on you, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? But then listen to what he says here about his heart. My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. Because of divine devotion, God refuses to wash his hands of his wayward people, Israel, and us, as we continue to be the object of his loving kindness and mercy. This same covenant devotion extends to the most important demonstration of God's mercy, the Christ. It can be said that Jesus is the supreme expression of God's mercy. He is the supreme expression of not just mercy, but love and grace as well. Through God's mercy in sending Jesus, the lost become found, and we gain a new identity as God's people. The Apostle Peter reminds us of this mercy in this memorable verse. Once you were not a people, but now you are. Now you are the people of God. And once, remember before, you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This truth for which we should be eternally grateful and humble, this truth cannot be expressed without enough emphasis. People, all people, Jews and Gentile, every nation, tribe, people, everything, all people alike, come into relationship with God today only because God extends mercy to us. Don't forget that. No matter our efforts, salvation, forgiveness, it's all a matter of God being merciful and making that way. In his ministry, going back to Jesus, Jesus also gave us this practical expression to understand God's mercy in showing his healing and forgiveness during his time in this world. Even the cross, despite its violence, is an expression of the mercy of God. Jesus condescends to human form, and then he dies a horrific death only to rise again, so that the forces of sin that cause so much of the misery and suffering within God's people, both of these things are once and for all defeated. This trouncing of sin does more than lift our face, lift our countenance, to use a Bible word. It's the avenue through which forgiveness becomes a reality. And just like I said about our covenant relationship, salvation is only by the mercy of God. Gratitude, devotion, and humility, when you think about it, are our only proper responses to this kind of mercy. You and I would do well to spend some time evaluating our response to God's beautiful mercy. The parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18, it provides a somewhat extreme example of the expectation placed on those who do benefit from God's mercy. As you read and consider the content of the parable, well, really of the whole Bible, and then put it alongside this video, and then study the Bible verses that we've highlighted here, your awareness of God's continual mercy towards us tells us that it should be an element of our lives and interactions with other people. You know, it's not just a one-way thing coming down to us. We should be showing this same mercy to others. The church should be especially known as this channel of God's mercy into a merciless world. Our practice of being merciful towards others, particularly in those instances where we judge it as going to the undeserved, is a demonstration of not only the righteousness planted within God's people, but the mercy as well. And we should view it as one of his merciful gifts. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of 167. Let us never be people who take the mercy and the grace and the love of God for granted. Guard your heart. Watch your life. Always being aware that compassion and merciful action toward those around us are the essence of Christian living. Be merciful and enjoy God's richest blessing.